Well, thank you everyone for joining me today. Today we're talking to Dr. Rezakhani, and we'll be talking about the Sassanid Empire. Maybe we can just start things off by providing an overview and context of the status quo in the Middle East before the Sassanids came to power.
Hi, thank you very much for having me. Good question, good place to start. So I should probably start just by saying that I have a bit of a problem with the Middle East as a terminology, but I'm guessing the listeners of your channel probably are already well familiar with the situation. In Central and West Asia, which is the general sort of the expanse of the various Iranian empires and dynasties and cultures. Prior to the rise of the Sasanians in the early third century, we have this sort of an unusual situation of the Parthian Empire or the Arsacid Empire, which has been ruling in the area for about 450 years at that point, and has never really been sort of a centralized empire, centralized power, has essentially started fragmenting. Further east in Central Asia, it has been having a bit of a problem, or I guess competition, with the newly rising power of the Kushans, which is really controlling the Transoxania region and the Hindu Kush and the northern India / Pakistan of today. And in the West, it has been facing a sort of competition from local powers in Armenia, in Georgia, in Western Iran, and probably most crushingly for the very terminal sort of the 30, 40 years in the end from the Roman Empire, which has been attacking further east. By this point, the Euphrates has been really the effective border between the two empires in its middle and southern course, and sort of the middle of the Euphrates Tigris Valley in the north. So this has been disturbed by an invasion from Emperor Caracalla, which is very short-lived and doesn't really last, but still shows certain structural problems with the Parthians. And so this is the world in which the Sasanians really, or Ardashir I, really rising in power.
Okay, interesting. And then what led to the actual rise of the Sassanids? So on the east, it sounds like they're facing a lot of nomadic peoples. On the west, they have the Roman Empire. Did the Parthians just collapse one day? Were they defeated militarily by the Romans? Were they defeated militarily by the Sassanids? What led to the transition between Parthian to Sassanid?
I just let me mention that in the East, it's not nomadic. In the East, there is an empire as strong as the Parthians, and I would say probably as strong and prosperous as at least that period of the Roman Empire. We notice that in the Roman Empire, we are entering the so-called crisis of the third century, that the Romans are actually economically and militarily are actually declining as well. So I would actually say this is a cross-Mediterranean West Asian phenomenon. This changes, might have environmental and climatic reasons as well. But anyway, in the east, the Kushans are actually quite a strong empire, stretching anywhere from Transoxiana to the middle of India. And they're actually a very prosperous and rich empire, which seem to coming into adapting Buddhism in some sort of a state religion, which is very consistent with the rest of the late antique period, where religion gets a central sort of place in the empires. Sasanians specifically seem to be the descendant of a local dynasty in southern Iran, in the province of Persis, around the modern Iranian province of Fars, which is also where the Achaemenid emperors came from. And they have been, throughout the Parthian period, they have been ruling as either autonomous or fully independent dynasty in the south, in the region. And by this point, by the terminal Parthian point, this kingdom of Persis is actually part of the Parthian Empire proper. They accept the Parthians as their overlords, although they have a degree of autonomy in the sense of issuing their own coins and things. And then Ardashir, first his father and older brother, Babak and Shapur, seem to rise in rebellion against these local dynasts. And then Ardashir continues the rebellion of his father and brother, as we can judge by his coins, where one side is the face of Ardashir, the other side is the face of his brother. And then from this, he starts conquering and going against the Parthians. Sometimes in about 220, between 222 to 24 AD, he meets the last, sort of, you could call him the premium or the Parthian High King, the Arsacid High King, which is known as Artabanus IV, or if you believe one of the papers I wrote, Artabanus V, in somewhere in western Iran, defeats him. We have reliefs of him actually, killing the king, and like the reliefs suggest that Ardashir personally kills Artabanus IV. Whether this is real or not, we don't know. But anyway, the Parthian king of kings gets killed. And then, well, from numismatic evidence and other sources, we know that there was another Parthian king, Vologases VI, 2 years later, which seems to have somehow been removed without much violent military action. But anyway, not there anymore. He doesn't issue coins anymore. And Ardashir slowly becomes really what they call king of kings in a literal sense, because as we will go, I will explain that they seem to be taking this literally, like king of kings. There are kings.
Interesting. So, was there a dramatic change in the state itself when it shifted from Parthian to Sassanid, or could it be seen kind of as a change in dynasty, as the Roman Empire changed from the Julio-Claudian Empire from the Julio-Claudian dynasty to another dynasty, or was it really a brand new empire with new institution and new cultural norms and so on?
So yes, Ardashir really is a member of this, I guess, side family of these local rulers of Persis that initially follows the rebellion of his father and brother, and fights against the um, Parthian king of kings, Artabanus IV. At the beginning, somewhere in eastern Iran, there are reliefs that show him actually defeating and killing the king himself. That's probably a propaganda, but sometimes around 224, he really becomes the king of kings. There is a Parthian claimant, Vologases VI, that lasts for a couple more years. We have coins of him, and then he disappears. And then as Ardashir really establishes himself as the king of kings of Iran. And this is literal, king of kings, king of many kings. And I think this is something that we have to consider about the centralization and the issue of how the kingship works. I like to talk about it more. I've likened it before to Irish high kingship and how that works, really.
Interesting. So, was the rise of the Sassanids really a drastic change in the Persian Empire? If we can just be agnostic, or was it more just of a continuation of a longer empire? Similar to how the Judeo-Claudian dynasty was followed by another dynasty, or were the Sassanids really very different? That they changed the state institutions and the culture and the way that the empire functioned? Yeah, would love your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Well, I guess here we run into a fundamental problem in Sasanian Empire. And that is that we have very little information from inside the empire. Whatever tradition of historiography that the Sasanians had has not reached us in original form from the periods that we are talking about. So it's actually interesting that in this early period, from the period of the son of Ardashir I, Shapur I, we do have an inscription called the inscription of Shapur Kabe Zartosh, or shortened to SKZ, that does give us some information. It's really a victory inscription, for lack of a better term, that gives us some information about the Sasanian early empire. But the rest of it, we are really reliant on Roman and, Roman, Greco-Roman generally, written in Greek and in Latin. And then sometimes historiography of the Syriac church at a later point, and later Armenian, and then mostly on early Islamic and medieval Islamic sources, which are written several hundred years later and don't necessarily pay attention to the same things that we want them. So a lot of the answer to your question has been interpreted through this fact. The fact is that for the Romans, for Roman historians, Sasanians display a complete new game, particularly since then they are initially very aggressive towards Rome and gain great successes towards Roman state. And eventually they would become a fundamentally different empire, as you put it. But how in their early period they really have this different character is a point of controversy. I don't think that the early Sasanian Empire is a fundamentally different empire than the late Parthian one. Possibly more, at least the person of the King of Kings is in a more stable position. But I wouldn't put that stability as that much above, say, as you said, the Julio-Claudians. The latter Julio-Claudians are shambolic as well, after Caracalla and Claudius and then Nero. But I don't think that you can necessarily say that the state that Vespasian and Titus were ruling over was necessarily very fundamentally different than what was before. But you could say that, yes, the state of the Trajan and Hadrian is fundamentally different, and so on and so forth. So it is a bit of a hard question to answer. From the point of view of modern historiography, we tend to think that Parthians, the Arsacids, were completely falling apart, and that the Sasanians came and established a new system. I don't think historiographically that is true. I think that's a hyperbolic way of looking at it, really.
Interesting. Yeah, I think it's interesting that when we talk about a lot of Western empires, whether it's the Roman Empire, we talk about it as the Roman Empire, whether it's, when it's a democracy or when it's ruled by an emperor, when all these different dynasties rule it. But when we talk about the Persian Empire, it's broken down into the Achaemenians, the Parthians, and so on. So I've always wondered, were they actually different? So I really appreciate that answer. Just a question, just to deep dive quickly, and maybe a bit of a side note. Why don't we have any records from the Sasanians themselves? Like, why do we need to rely on external sources?
I don't think we don't. I think it's the way historians look for sources, right? I think a lot of it is that we establish our narratives of modern historiographical narratives on what we call primary sources. These primary sources are the text written by certain authors in the ancient period and have reached our period in some sort of a manuscript form, which we then edit and print and read, as the text that we read, right? Have also reached us in high medieval and late medieval manuscripts. It's just that they have been re-recorded and rewritten constantly in the same original language. So the actual manuscript that we are referring to is from the 12th century, right? But it is written in Greek. So we say, okay, then this preserves the words of, I don't know, I'm trying to think of, let's say Procopius, right? Which is written in the 6th century. We don't actually have a manuscript of Procopius from the 6th century, right? So I guess in the in the Sasanian senses, this wasn't seen as necessary, because what we preserve then in Islamic sources and medieval Persian sources, which are from the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th century, then we could say that they are preserving a Sasanian record. That was the Sasanian record. It's just that it's recorded in Arabic and in New Persian, not in the original Middle Persian or whatever language they were written. I think that's one problem, that we imagine that this hasn't reached us in that sense. And the other issue is we are used to a sort of chronographical historiography that seems to be a particular tradition of history, where you go by date. This happened in this date, this happened in this date. Various other sorts of narratives of history are possible. And if you look at it in like that, we do actually have a lot of sources. It's just that the value and the priority we give to sources as modern historians, because after all, history is a modern subject. It was invented in the 19th century, really. So based on 19th century standards, if you don't have certain sources, you don't look at them. But we have to just be creative about it. I guess one of my very smart and inspiring mentors once said it, that it's not that there is a lack of sources, it's that we are asking the wrong questions. Sources are there. We are asking historical questions that we have designed for Roman history based on Roman sources. And then now we want to fit these questions to the sources for the Sasanians and for the Indians and for the Arabs and for the Chinese and for the Aztecs and for the Incas and everybody else. People obviously kept records. They had an interest in keeping records. It's just that we are asking questions that has been designed for a set of sources from all sources, as if all sources are equal.
Thank you for that really robust answer. So now going back to Ardashir. So he came to power, he became the kings of king. What other reforms did he set in place that laid the groundwork for the Sassanids to be who they were? And what were those initial aggressive actions that you mentioned earlier?
It seems that Ardashir is quite well. Okay, so based on written sources, Ardashir seems to be quite belligerent, is quite interested in various sorts of conquering activities, because the sources we have constantly talk about him conquering in the west, going east, taking over parts of Transoxiana and well, the greater Khorasan, or whatever you want to call it, the modern region of Hindu Kush and Afghanistan, then coming down, conquering Sistan, conquering. He seems to be very much this image of the conquering hero, which we also have for Cyrus, the founder of the Achaemenid dynasty. Interestingly enough, we don't have it for Arsaces, the founder of the Arsacid dynasty, which tells you something about historiography of the Arsacids. This is what the narratives say. I think that one of the most significant thing that we see, and that comes from the fact that I'm a numismatist, so maybe that's why I notice those things more, is that Ardashir actually starts a series of uniform Sasanian coinage. So the Sasanian coinage type that Ardashir establishes becomes the dominant. There are little changes, but that is really the coinage that starts spreading across the entire territory, and there is no other coins. Prior to this, Arsaces were issuing coins. All of these small dynasties of Persis and Elymais and Mycenae were in the Parthians in the east, and that. Everybody is issuing their own coins. There are different shapes, there are different styles, there are different scripts. No, Ardashir establishes this series of coins. They become dominant, and of course, the coins by their iconography might tell us certain things. First of all, it's written in Middle Persian, in a Pahlavi dialect, with all the bells and whistles of Pahlavi writing system that I wouldn't bore you with. It has the picture of a fire altar in the reverse side of the coin, with the words "Fire of Ardashir" on it. Later, a couple of attendants are added as well. And then the front of the obverse of the coin says, the Lord Mazdayasna worshipping King of Kings, Ardashir, who is descended from the line of the gods. So he has this Mazdayasna, which is the internal name of Zoroastrianism. He claims the king of kingship. He uses the word Iran, and he says that he's a descendant of gods. So this religious iconography, political statesman, these things very much are present. So I would say, if we want to say something, he certainly seems to be creating a centralized monetary policy, and somehow he's using this divine appointment of a Mazda worshipping King of Kings as his role. This is who I am, right? I'm not just one of the kings anymore. I am the King of Kings. I am descended from the god, and I am Mazda Yasnan. Which, if I might open a parenthesis, there is an entire controversy about the role of religion in the foundation of the Sasanian dynasty. Almost all early Islamic sources tell us that Ardashir came from a dynasty of priests of a certain temple in Persis. I personally take that with a grain of salt that that is actually true, but you can't deny that the guy does have a religious side to his kingship. Well, now, whatever that is, we have to figure that out first.
So it's the Zoroastrian equivalent of the mandate of heaven, it sounds like, where
I guess, which we very much have that because there is something called Farre Izadi in Persian and Middle Persian, Khwarna or Farra, which is a Western Zoroastrian concept. And basically, not having it means that you cannot be king. We actually have it in the mythological, tales that one of the famous kings loses it to a competing king and he loses kingship and the competing king becomes king. So yes, it's very much mandate of heaven. The Farre Izadi, I think we can translate it as some sort of a divine glory. Not having the divine glory means you can't be a king.
interesting. So it's a very Zoroastrian inspired administration, we could say. How did the
And
Sassanids treat religious minorities, whether it's Christians, Jews, and other minorities?
very good question. I would say as strong as the religious characteristic is, it seems to be pluralistic. Because a bit further on, during the time of Ardashir's son, Shapur I, we have this new prophet, Mani, the founder of Manichaeism, which you might have heard of, who comes on and starts preaching. And Shapur himself, the king of kings, allows him to preach. And Manichaean sources even say that he might have converted to Manichaeism, which I think, again, is hyperbolic exaggeration. His son, Hormuz Ardashir, Hormuz I, seems to have been very much supporting this. And of course, his grandson is his other son, and his grandson are not, and they actually end up killing the prophet. But anyway, Mani is active. And Mani writes something in Middle Persian and actually dedicates it to Shapur.
Can we talk a little bit about the difference between Zoroastrianism and Manichaeism?
Manichaeism.
I
Oh,
haven't I
that would
haven't
be
heard
very,
much
that
about
would be
it.
very, let me answer your other question and then get
Okay.
to Manichaeism. Same thing seems to be, at least on Judaism. Jews have a long presence in Mesopotamia, which slowly in the fourth century really moves on to become the center of Sasanian Empire. But prior to that is a very central region of the Arsacids as well, and continues to be very important part of anywhere really from the Achaemenid period to this period. Mesopotamia is one of the major regions of the various Iranian empires, and of course the future center of the Sasanians as well. And Jews are very present there. We don't know exactly from when, but most likely it is from sometimes in the Parthian period, but maybe as early as the Achaemenid period, and the Babylonian captivity and everything. So they seem to be very active over there. And actually, the largest part of the Talmud, the so-called oral Torah, which is the major book of rabbinic Jewish teaching and still holds a central position within Judaism, is actually written under the Sasanian rule in Mesopotamia. So, and the evidence we have of it is very, very present as the evidence that Jews were practicing their religion, had an administrative system of some sort, and were in very close interaction with everybody else in the region. Mesopotamia, after all, mostly has a population that are Aramaic speaking. We have no reason to believe that prior to, for example, converting to Christianity, because that's what they do. Most of the Aramaic speaking population does become Christian, that they didn't believe in other religions, that they were ever really Zoroastrian. So even prior to converting to Christianity, they were there. It seems there is a whole lot of debate going on about the exact nature of religious communities, interactions and connections to the Sasanian Empire. But all in all, Zoroastrianism is not a religion that tries to convert everybody. It seems to actually, up to a point, be an ethno-religion, limited to the people that call themselves Er or Eran, being the plural of it, the heirs. That's where the word Iran comes from. Seems to be actually limited to that population. And it's not a supersessionist religion. It's not trying to convert the whole world. It's not a universalist or supersessionist religion. So, yeah, it's basically seems to be that the Sasanian beyond tolerates other religions. They deal with the fact that there are other religions. What is the nature of the relationship of the Sasanian state to minorities? Harder to say. Recently, a very interesting book by a very good friend of mine, Dr. Simcha Gross, was published on the relationship of the Jewish community with the Sasanians, which I think methodologically is a very good way of following up on how these things were done. Usually the assumption was that each of these religious minorities have a head. The Jewish one was known as Rosh Galuta, but I think Simcha is arguing that that wasn't the permanent position. The Christian one was represented by various patriarchs and bishops, and what their relationship is, how they adjudicate law within the community, between the community and the larger Sasanian community, and how they relate to the state via payment of taxes, is something that I can't give you a straight answer for. I can just tell you that it's not too antagonistic, except the Armenian one in the fourth century does become antagonistic in the 5th century, really, which I like to talk about at a later point. But yeah, that's sort of the Armenian one becomes more of a political sense translated through a religious prism, but it seems to be much more of a territorial political thing.
Can we talk about the difference between Zoroastrianism and Manichaeism?
Manichaeism, yes. The differences between Zoroastrianism, well, depending on who you ask, Manichaeism is either a Zoroastrian-based religion trying to talk the language of Christianity, or is a Christian cult trying to appeal to Zoroastrians.
Interesting.
It's a question of chicken and eggs with Manichaeism. The issue with Manichaeism is that we actually have quite a bit of documents from it, although they are fairly understudied in the sense that there are not as many scholars as we like working on Manichaean texts. And of course, a lot we know about the Manichaeism is also set through very antagonistic and polemical discourses of both early Christian writers and scholars, and later Zoroastrian and then Muslim writers and scholars. So there is a generally bad view of the Manichaeans, which results in us not knowing what it is. In a sense, Manichaeism, to me, sounds like well placed in this entire pre-Constantinian Christian plurality that is going on in the entire Eastern Mediterranean, Europe, North Africa, and Mesopotamia, where you have a lot of various Christian theological, Christological arguments going on. Some of them get translated as this Gnostic form, which I don't like the term Gnostic, but it gets used. And basically it has ritualistic, theological, Christological, legal, even I think mostly with Christianity, philological issues going on. And I think Manichaeism is born out of this, with Mani, who very clearly says that I'm a prophet and I'm better than the prophets before me, because the prophets before me, first of all, they only came for a particular group of people, and I came for everybody. I came for the whole world, which is sort of, you have some versions of early Christianity, I think Paul and onwards does have that. But also, I am the person who's writing my own words down. So I don't leave it to my apostles to write it for you. I'm writing my own words, and creates this very complicated world in which there is basically the material world is evil, and the spiritual world is something that has to be sort of encouraged, which has something to do with the ideas of light and darkness and matter and things in both Neoplatonic philosophy and in Zoroastrian mythology, but also takes on the character of Jesus and a whole lot of Jewish Christian argumentation into account, and creates this philosophy that I'm very disqualified to actually talk about in detail, but also has a lot of Zoroastrian and Christian language. So it's a new religion, saying how different it is than Zoroastrianism is sort of trying to say what is the difference between Zoroastrianism and Christianity.
Yeah.
It's a new religion. It has an entire new world imagined.
Okay. So the Sasanians are quite pluralistic in their religious tolerance. What about their ethnic kind of, tolerance and population? I think there's Persians, Arabs, you mentioned Armenians. How did the empire manage this diverse population?
Linguistically, at least, which is how we often differentiate between these groups these days. I haven't seen evidence of linguistic recognition of different groups. Sasanians seem to have been very much into regional differences, right? So where you can come from, what is the background? But there is this concept of heir and aner. So heir in Sasanian mind seems to be a sort of population, which initially Ardashir on his coins calls himself the king of kings of heirs, Eiran. His son in his inscription, Shapur, says king of kings of Eiran and Aneran. And then after him, this actually goes on the coins. Now, this Aneran means non-heir, right? So what is this heir? One thing is that this heir are the Mazdakite, or the Zoroastrians, right? And that aner are not the Zoroastrians. And actually, certain people are counted among the non-heir over which the king of kings rules, including those Arabs that you said, and a number of other people. And then, depending on which source you read, because the king calls Armenians heir, but then there is a Zoroastrian priest, famous Zoroastrian priest called Kerdir, who has his own inscription, who calls Armenians aner. So even that is not that clear. So this is the general thing I can tell. The rest of it, we don't really have much evidence, except in specific cases. We have evidence of violence and war and problems against Armenians. We have, from Syriac sources, a whole lot of evidence of basically being both the Syriac speakers and particularly Christians being treated as the fifth column of the Roman Empire, particularly after Theodosius the Great, after Christianity becomes an official religion of the Roman Empire. So in the 5th and 6th century, sometimes Christians are seen as that, and connected to that maybe the Syrian population. And then earlier on, but in the context of Islamic sources, actions of kings such as Shapur II against the Arabs that have conquered part of, or invaded, they have entered to parts of southern Mesopotamia, evidence against them. But none of this seems to be a sort of an ethnic policy, a clear ethnic policy. We have very little information about if they even showed any particular awareness of, for example, East Iranian elements of Sogdians and the Bactrians and the Khwarezmians, and if they treated them in any sense differently, or if Indians were treated differently. And it doesn't seem like it. There is no evidence of anything of the sort on that side. But also it either doesn't exist or is a function of the sources we're using. So in each stream, I think the Armenian and Arab case are things that I like to comment on more, because I think if we want to go back to them, I think those are the cases that we could study and have been studied and are very interesting, actually.
Okay. Let's talk about the military stuff. So
okay,
it's an empire surrounded by the Romans on one side, another empire on the other side. You have the Armenians that you mentioned as well. What's happening in terms of military, confrontations and battles?
Yeah. Well, it's an empire, so military war is sort of, you could say, one of its main roles. Violence is always sort of integrated into the DNA of all empires. Um, at the beginning, well, the empire is made by military action, really. As far as foreign threat goes, Romans on the west, and then initially probably the Kushans in the east, but the situation doesn't necessarily stay the same. Romans continue to be a point of controversy and war and various sorts of aggressive actions in the west, although from the middle of the fourth century to beginning of the 6th century, there seems to be a period of relative peace with the Romans. But then that is a period where the East becomes really important. That is where the groups that we call Iranian Huns or Chionites, which we might know under, people might have heard under the names Kidarites and the Hephthalites and stuff, appear there. And they actually engage in very aggressive military confrontation with the Sasanians. Bahram V at the beginning of the 5th century, and then his grandson Peruz run a series of very sort of devastating campaigns against these eastern groups, particularly the Kedarites, and destroy them. They managed to destroy them, except as with all successes, it comes back to bite them in the sense that Peruz is actually killed in a famous confrontation in 484 with the Hephthalites, another Eastern power, who then actually defeats Peruz, and he falls into a ditch and dies. And for about 20 years, Sasanians are essentially at the mercy of the Hephthalites, and Hephthalites seem to be playing musical chairs with Sasanian princes. And then in the 6th century, as a result of this, I have argued in several articles, that is my specific expertise, actually, the 6th and the 7th century. As a result of this defeat, Sasanians become a Western-looking empire. They restart war with Rome. And I think this is the war that everybody has the memories of, because this becomes a perpetual, destructive, total war where the both sides are not playing a game of balance anymore. They want to destroy each other. They want to actually conquer and destroy the entire territory of the other one. Notice 100 years before this, it has been so cool that when the Roman emperor was dying, he asked the Sasanian emperor Yazgir I to become the guardian of his son Theodosius II. But this is a peaceful period. 100 years later, Procopius finds this suggestion absurd, says that this is a made-up story, that Romans and Sasanians would never trust each other like that, because they are trying to destroy each other. The entire 6th century, and in the early 7th century, Khusro II, the Sasanian emperor, actually very much comes very close to managing this. He actually conquers the entire Eastern Mediterranean, Egypt, and Anatolia, and comes to the borders of Constantinople. And it's not a one-off 2-day thing. He controls all of this region for 10 years or more. For about half a generation, Sasanians are actually ruling, and they're very close. At one point, Heraclius even offers to abdicate the throne and let the Sasanian emperor decide the emperor. It means that they are actually going for this very aggressive military action, which I think has something to do with the fall of the Sasanians themselves and the Islamic conquest. So it starts with regular imperial expansionist policies and military action, but then becomes a world war. It really becomes something that wants to end up in destruction of each other. And, well, the success is not exactly as they imagine.
So what happened? They conquered all this area. They were at the gates of Constantinople. What happened?
Well, what happened is that, well, do you want to go to the end of it? I thought we wanted to talk about, well, we can go back to the earlier period. Well, basically, the regular narrative is that Heraclius, the Roman emperor, the Byzantine emperor, let's call him at that point, runs a series of successful counterattacks and essentially comes to the northern Mesopotamian region, which forces a military coup against Khosrow II in February of 628, which results in the fall of the regime of Khosrow II. And then that quickly weakens the basis of the Sasanian power and military action. And then they get conquered by the Arab conquerors. And then Heraclius goes back. I think this is too simplistic of a imagination of this. And I think we have to redo it. And I have been redoing it. I think the answer is a lot more complicated. And I think that it is part of a larger Western Eurasian sort of military, economic, social, religious, and political events that has been happening since the middle of the 6th century, and really ends up in the rise of Islam in place of the Sasanians. So that's too complicated. That probably is more fitting for a talk on the rise of Islam, early Islam, which I think I would love to talk about, but it's a totally different thing.
We can talk about that another time. But okay, so now let's talk about the decline and the fall. So these conflicts with Rome lead to kind of internal crumbling. Was that internal weakness? Is that what led to
I don't think they lead to internal crumbling. I don't think that is true.
Okay.
That is something I'm
I see. Okay.
I'm actually going against. It's actually, there is no signs of decline in the empire in the 6th and 7th century. The economy seems to be actually on the rise. There is a huge economic reforms in the 6th century, which seems to have encouraged production, economic production. It has certainly increased the capital, one of the factors of production. It seems to have encouraged the existence of a middle producing economic class. And there is no sign of the weaknesses of the empire the way we imagine it. The treasury is not depleted. The army does not seem to be in a state of collapse. And structurally, the empire seems fine. The fall of the Sasanian Empire, and I know this is controversial, and unless you read my articles and I can make a 2-hour argument for you, which I have done, by the way. I have had that interview. I would love to do that interview again in English, is quite accidental. It really has to do with the fall of the Sasanian dynasty. The dynasty does not manage to keep power, but it exactly becomes what you were talking about. The dynasty disappears, but the empire continues. And that's my controversial suggestion, that the fall of the dynasty, which in Iranian history often is interpreted as the fall of the structure, does not happen in this case. The structure survives. The structure actually is so robust that it manages to quickly take over and become part of a new, very successful system, which is the Islamic Caliphate. The dynasty doesn't manage it. And that doesn't really mean anything. The loss of a dynasty doesn't, in the bigger thing, doesn't really mean anything. I think the Sasanian weakness really is 5th century. Their fall, if you want to say, if the Sasanians ever fall, is in 484, when Piruz is killed, because that is when the empire loses its financial resources, the economy is in shambles, there seems to be deep religious and social problems, judging from the subsequent rebellion of Mazdak. And of course, the emperor is dead, and a foreign power really manages for 20 years to call out all the shots and come up with emperors for the empire. So I would say maybe we have to talk about 2 different dynasties, a dynasty that disappears in 484 and a whole new phoenix of an empire that rises in 502 from the ashes of that dynasty and becomes the late Sasanian empire, which manages for 140 years pretty well, but then loses power over the system. Maybe the system outgrows the empire, the dynasty. I think that's the answer. They are so successful in creating a system that the system outlives them.
Okay. So is the common traditional theory that the civil war um, between 628 and 632, which then led to weakness, allowed the Arabs to kind of beat the Sassanids. And you're saying you have an alternative theory to that, correct?
You really want me to talk about the
No, no, no. We don't need to talk about it.
yes,
I'm curious
yes,
so that our
yes,
listeners can understand what the kind of
yes,
mainstream theory is and what your theory is.
yes. I think that is the mainstream theory,
Okay.
that the events of after the fall, after the death of Khosrow II, and before the election of Yazgir III in 632, um, are the main elements causing the fall of the empire. I disagree with that. Yes.
Okay. Do you give any credit to the military prowess of the Arabs at all, like in the Battle of Qadisiyah, were they just
Of course.
superior?
Well, not in the Battle of Qadisiyah, but okay. I will then give you the my parts of my theory. Who were the Sasanian soldiers actually doing the conquest for Khosrow II? That is the I guess my leading people. They are the Arabs. The
Hmm.
Sasanian West, Mesopotamia, is where Arabs live, and Arabs are also in Syria. And these are exactly the regions that the Sasanians are conquering, right? So it is the military prowess and robustness of the Arab tribes and the Arab presence in that region that even makes the Sasanian success against the Romans possible, right?
Interesting.
It's just that there is a head of the whole thing at one point, a Sasanian emperor Khosrow II, and now the head is somebody in Medina called Omar. The conquests are done by Arabs. The Sasanian conquests are done by Arabs,
Yeah.
right? This is this issue. We imagine because we ethnicize these things, like Sasanian Persian Empire, as if Sasanians actually go to the province of Persis, put people on the back of horses, and bring them all the way to Mesopotamia to conquer. No, they are using the local people, and the local people are Arabs.
So the military class of the late Sasanian Empire was Arab in itself.
Exactly.
So the
That
Arab
is
conquest can be seen as a military coup, or is that too far of a
as
stretch?
okay. The way I have put it is that these Arab soldiers and mercenaries, let's call them, after the death of the Sasanian emperor, they don't have an overlord, they don't have a leader, they don't have
Mm.
an ultimate general. So they become autocephalous actors who have conquered. And initially, well, of course, the first thing is if you have gone and conquered a city, and now you don't have to send the income of that city to a king somewhere far away in Ctesiphon. You keep it for yourself and you claim authority yourself. But of course, the people of the city don't really listen to you. They need a higher authority, right?
Yeah.
So initially, these become independent warlords who then proceed to becoming part of a grand state, which becomes the early Islamic state, really. So I would say the early Islamic conquests, let's call them. I'm giving away too much of my theory that thing. But barely, what I'm saying that early Islamic conquest is up to a large point. There are military conquests. There are military actions. I'm not denying the existence of military actions. But a lot of these great things also have a managerial side to them.
Mm.
It's the success of people like Khalid ibn Walid and Amr ibn As in controlling the conquests that have already happened, managing them properly, and bringing their benefits to the government in Medina. I think that's the thing you have to look at, not the actual people getting on horses and going and
Yeah.
defeating Sasanian soldiers, which are probably Arabs themselves.
Yeah. They had
Yeah.
great leadership. Okay, great. Well, to wrap, maybe is there anything that you think we've missed? Can we talk about maybe the long-lasting legacy, cultural impact of the Sassanids before we wrap it up?
I think we missed sort of the middle section. We didn't really talk about the fourth and the fifth century much.
Let's
Uh,
talk about them. What happened then? What were the key things that you think our
I
audience should know?
I think the key thing is that the early Sasanian Empire is really more of, as I said, a empire that is ruling based on late Parthian understanding of the empire. So the king is the king of kings. There are still regional power structures, and the king is really trying to control some of these regional power structures through various means. I think the almost adoption of Manichaeism by Shapur I might have been an aspect of this, using this universal powers of Manichaeism. And also that Sasanians are mostly based inside the Iranian plateau. So the early capitals are actually in Persis, and then they move to Khuzestan, right? But beginning in the 4th century, and really with the rule of Shapur II, which is at the same time as Constantine is ruling in the Roman Empire, and Constantine has moved his capital east to Constantinople. Notice he's not in Italy anymore. He's now in Constantinople. And Sasanians exactly at this point enter Mesopotamia and make Mesopotamia their center, right? This has two things. First of all, both empires want to make use of economic resources offered by the Anatolian, Syrian, larger Syrian world, and this land in between. Notice this is also the time that we have just sort of recovered from the rebellion of Zenobia and the empire of Palmyra. So Arabs, these in-between people, whether we call them Arabs or not, because I have a very good friend who claims that the identity doesn't exist during this time, but let's call them with the title of Tayyaya, which is the Syriac word for them. The Tayyaya, whoever, the desert's powers, making themselves important enough that they have to be understood and be taken seriously. And also the resources of all of this area, particularly the northern part of it, northern Mesopotamia, northern Syria, is important enough for both of the empires to take notice of. And they're moving west and east sort of at the same time and bordering this land. I think Eastern Mediterranean, the greater Bilad Sham region, and Anatolia, and of course Egypt, and for the Iranians, the Caucasus, is becoming important enough that both empires are moving there. And this is also a beginning of, first of all, economic changes in the Sasanian Empire, also beginning of the political changes. This point onwards, Sasanians are becoming more and more centralized. That imperial idea we have of the Sasanians, of they are fundamentally different than the Parthians because they're very centralized. I think this is when it happens. It really happens in the 4th century. And at the same time, they have to deal with this great threat in the east. And I think moving the capital to Mesopotamia is actually very related to that great threat in the east, because they wanted to be as far away from the Easterners as possible, and very smartly so as well, because again, in 484, the Easterners managed to defeat the Sasanian emperor. But it also has to do with trying to protect their own internal trade networks, which is very important, because you have to notice that the nature of the Sasanian Empire, the climate of the Sasanian Empire is very unusual. Mesopotamia is a very fertile region. Southern Iran, Khuzestan, and parts of Fars are also very fertile. But the further east you go, it's mountains and empty regions, empty deserts. And so each one of these empires' sections are connected to each other through these very complicated trade networks. And I think these trade networks have to be protected very well in order to keep the empire together. And I think this is where the empire uses its power of ideology, power of economic changes, military, everything, to keep the system together and centralize it very well. And this is the major challenge they feel in the 5th century, and 4th and 5th century. And I think this is also why there is a lot of peace with the Romans, because the western border is safe. I think they have, at least in the 4th and 5th century, they have reached a state of equilibrium where the Romans, by using the Mediterranean as their own internal connecting network, are using enough of the Eastern Mediterranean resources. And the Sasanians have also reached what they want. They have taken Mesopotamia, one of the centers of civilization, right? They have their own bread baskets. Romans have Egypt, which is their own bread basket. So they are okay in the West. And that's why the 4th and 5th century is particularly peaceful with the Romans, but it's not at all peaceful in the East. They are constantly fighting. They're constantly trying to hold their own against these Eastern powers. This is where you have the buildup of all of these walls in Central Asia that Sasanians really, at the same time as the Chinese start making walls against these inner Asian invaders, the Sasanians are doing the same thing, right? And outside their borders, all of these changes are happening. And 5th century becomes a very challenging time for the Sasanians. That's where also Armenians come into play, which we didn't get to talk about because they are very important, but in another context. So I think the 5th and the 6th century is really, I would say, if I want to say classical Sasanian Empire, is really the 4th and the 5th century. We are talking about that empire. And if you notice in later sources, when you read about, in Islamic sources, when you read about the Sasanians, there are two kings they keep on mentioning. One is Khusro I, Ardashir I, in the 6th century, the great reforming emperor, the great emperor that everybody, whose name becomes the word for king in Persian and for the Sasanian king in Arabic. You know, the word Kasra in Arabic that we use for Sasanian. The Sasanians even get to be called Akasere. The dynasty of Kisras comes from the name of Khusro I. Khusro, that's the name of Khusro. Same as Caesar or Caesar, or Kaiser or whatever, same thing. So that's him. But the other one is Bahram V, is the king who lives and rules in the first half of the 5th century, about, I would want to say 421 to 450 something, I think. I'm never good with dates, but he's the classical Sasanian king. Why? Because he has all the visuals of a Sasanian king. He's a warrior. He goes and defeats the Easterners, but he's also the partier. He's known as the person who has the grand courts, the parties. He brought a group of people from India because they were musicians. So he moves a bunch of people to his empire because they're musicians. We have pictures of him hunting of various things. His epithet is the Gore, which means the wild ass, because he was hunting onager. So, he's into hunting. And then there are a lot of romance. Nizami, the classical Persian poet, actually wrote an entire grand book about the romances of Bahram V. And he is the perfect Sasanian king. He is educated, he is artistic, he is into having a good time. He shows the glory of the empire. The empire is grand during his time, and he also keeps the borders of the empire safe. He defeats the Easterners, he defeats the Romans, he brings the Armenians, and he is the king. He is the king of, in Persian, we have this word Razman Bazm. Raz means war, Baz means partying. He is the king of Razman Baz. He has both sides. So I think 4th and 5th century is the classical Sasanian period. If we are talking about the empire, we're talking about that. And certainly later Islamic sources, when they mean Sasanians, they mean that. Bahram V is the person they're talking about.
Can we quickly talk about Armenia? You mentioned it a couple times, and I think our listeners really want to know what was going on between the Persians and the Armenians.
I think it is worth another thing by itself. But in short, Armenians traditionally, for quite a few hundred years, have been within Iranian political world since the Achaemenid period. Of course, there has been an Armenian dynasty of Tigranes the Great, some in the 2nd century BC, so on and so forth. But at least since the Parthian period, 1st century AD, Armenia's even ruling dynasty has been a branch of the Parthians. Their last name is Arshakuni. They are related to the Arsacids, Parthian kings of Iran. During the Sasanian period, early on, there seems to be a symbiotic relations. And Armenians somehow consider the Armenian Arshakunis somehow consider the Sasanians to be new kids on the block. These are newcomers from that area. We are this grand Arshakuni family, or this grand Arsacid family from the older times. Our cousins were ruling the empire, and now that our cousins are gone, we are the most qualified to rule this empire. So it's interesting. For the Armenians, they are part of Iran. they really deserve the kingship of the whole thing, right? So they initially see themselves like that. Sometimes in the 4th century, the rising popularity of Christianity and its sort of entry into Armenia from the Byzantine world, mostly from the Roman world, although the claim is that Armenia has become Christian before Constantine, but let's take that with a grain of salt. This starts moving Armenians very much away from the Sasanian core and forming their own identity. This is also the introduction of Armenian script, which very much has to do with Armenian identity. So Armenian identity is really the Armenian language and script plus Christianity, the Armenian Gregorian Christianity, right? And this starts becoming something that Armenians, first of all, very, very much start identifying with. So Armenian historians start identifying themselves very much like that. I think it's the only place where after the apostolic grand bishop, Gregor Lusavoric Gregory the Illuminator, the most important other character is a person called Mezrop Mashtots, who invents the Armenian alphabet. No other culture, the inventor of the alphabet is as big of a guy as it is in the Armenian culture. So it very much creates this identity, which creates a lot of problems with the Sasanian authorities, because they're very close, very, very obviously pulling away. I would say, if I'm very crudely, if I want to compare it to something, I would say it's like the comparison of the situation in Judea in the period of Augustus and onwards, which results in the Roman conquest of Judea and destruction of the first temple and stuff. Because they were feeling that they don't quite fit in the empire, the Armenians weren't quite fitting in the empire anymore. And now the Armenian elite, being these grand families of Armenia, now they imagine themselves to also be more entitled to local authority, to more of the local resources. And it seems that Armenia is basically forming its own identity away from Iranian world. And, well, of course, the kingdom that is claiming to be the king of kings of Iran and Iran is not going to quite stand for this. So it basically results in a grand conflict in the early 5th century, during the time of Yazgir II, the son of Bahram Gur, the son of Bahram V, who we have mostly from Armenian sources, that sends a general in order to convert the Armenians to Zoroastrianism. I've always wanted to ask this question of, sources never said what were the Armenians before they became Christians, right? 100 years earlier, supposedly they converted to Christianity. What were they before? And it says something about the nature of Zoroastrianism. So your original question of what is Zoroastrianism? There's this attempt, and then there's this Armenian hero, Vahan Mamikonian, who, well, doesn't really succeed, but the fight that the Mamikonians, as protectors of Armenianness and Armenian Christianity, put up, and of course they're defeated. And the Arshakuni kings are removed, and Sasanians just establish a governor called the Marzban over Armenia. And Armenia, well, at least the eastern part of Armenia, which is the majority of it, gets integrated into the Sasanian Empire now, and you have this period of Marzban. But it very much results in this particular Armenian lament and nostalgia for their own identity, which is very interestingly intertwined with their Iranian identity. Because all of these elite families that they're very fond of, and they want their independence, and these elite families become the grand protectors of Christianity and founders of monasteries and all of it. These are all guys who are actually Parthian elites, and they mostly have these Iranian names, and they seem to see themselves as the true heirs of the Iranian empires against this sort of, in a weird way, foreign Sasanian power. They are the true Iranians, right? In a sense, they seem to see themselves like that. And the thing that for us becomes important is, other than this interaction, is this historical narrative that is created as a result of this Armenian struggle very much influences our understanding of the Sasanians. So, in a sense, we tend to see Armenia as a microcosm of the Sasanian world. And in a lot of times, a lot of historical models that we built are based on Armenian sources. And then we expand them to the grand style and scale of the Sasanians, which for me is very interesting because it's basically like Armenian identity against the Sasanians. But the remnants of the Sasanians start creating their own identity as Iranians against the Muslims. You see?
Yes.
They're like, this thing continues on. And how much can you expand this? So I think Armenia is Armenia's situation within the Sasanian Empire is historiographically fascinating.
Just layers and layers.
Exactly.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Rezakhani. I think we can speak for hours, but this has been incredibly insightful. And yeah, thanks again for your time.
Thank you.